I was standing in the kitchen with a pen shaking in my hand when he finally said it. His voice wasn't loud. That was the part that hurt. He didn't shout. He didn't even look angry. He just leaned against the counter, arms crossed, and said, "You're not my responsibility." The words sat there between us, heavy and finished, like something rehearsed. I felt my chest tighten, not from surprise, but from recognition. I had heard that sentence before, just never from him. I slid the papers across the table. They made a soft sound, barely anything. I said quietly, "Then sign this." He looked down, and in that pause, I knew whatever happened next would follow us for the rest of our lives. Before all of that, before the papers and the silence, my life had been built on routine. I believed in structure. I believed that if you showed up every day, if you stayed consistent, things would eventually settle into place. That belief carried me through my work, my marriage, and eventually into parenthood, even though I came to it later than most, and not the way I once imagined. My wife and I had tried for years, quietly, without drama. Doctor visits that ended with polite sympathy, conversations that stopped halfway through because neither of us wanted to finish the sentence. When adoption came up, it wasn't a rescue fantasy. It was practical. We had room. We had time. We had patience, or at least we thought we did. He was already 8 when he came to us. Old enough to have habits. Old enough to have memories that didn't include us. The agency warned us, gently, that he had learned how not to trust. That he tested limits. That he watched adults the way someone watches weather, waiting for the storm that always came. Eventually. At first, he was careful. Polite. Too polite. He thanked us for things no child should have to thank someone for. Food, a ride, a quiet house. At night, I'd hear him walking the hallway, stopping outside our door, then going back to his room without knocking. I pretended not to notice. I thought space was respect. I tried to be steady. I took him to school every morning, same time, same route. I helped with homework even when he didn't ask. I showed up to every meeting, every conference, every awkward conversation where teachers lowered their voices like they were talking about a defect instead of a child. When he acted out, I didn't raise mine. I told myself calm was stronger than force. But as the years passed, something shifted. Gratitude hardened into resistance. Questions turned into challenges. Rules became negotiations he never intended to honor. He stayed out late, lied badly, looked at me like I was a temporary solution he'd outgrow. My wife tried to bridge the gap. She had more softness than I did, more faith. When she got sick, slowly at first and then all at once, the balance in the house changed. After she died, the silence became louder than any argument we'd ever had. It was just him and me then, 2 people connected by paperwork and shared history, both pretending we knew what the other needed. I kept doing what I thought a father was supposed to do. He kept pushing harder each year, as if daring me to prove what I claimed to be. By the time he turned 18, the house no longer felt like a shelter. It felt like a waiting room, and neither of us knew who was supposed to leave first. The night everything tipped over didn't arrive with a warning. It came in through the front door at 2 in the morning, loud and careless, carrying the smell of alcohol and something sharper I didn't recognize at first. I was awake. I had learned not to sleep deeply anymore. When I heard the lock scrape, my first instinct wasn't anger. It was relief. He was alive. That was the bar I'd lowered things to. He didn't apologize. He didn't even acknowledge the time. He dropped his jacket on the chair like the house still belonged to him by default. When I asked where he'd been, he laughed. Not amused, not cruel, just dismissive. Like the question itself was outdated. I told him to sit down. He didn't. I told him again. He rolled his eyes and finally did it, sprawling instead of sitting, legs stretched out, claiming space he hadn't earned but had learned to take. I said we needed to talk about rules, about respect, about the fact that he was living under my roof and pretending that meant nothing. I kept my voice steady. I always did. Inside, I felt something thinning out, like fabric worn too long. That's when he said it. "You're not my responsibility," he told me, correcting himself mid-sentence. "I mean, I'm not yours." He said it like a clarification, like he was helping me understand something I'd missed. He went on, listing everything he didn't ask for: the adoption, the expectations, the way I looked at him when he disappointed me. He said I chose this, not him. He said blood mattered more than signatures, that I couldn't force something that wasn't there. I listened longer than I should have. I let him finish. When he finally stopped, the room felt emptied out, like the words had taken something with them. I told him he was right about one thing. Choice mattered. Responsibility wasn't automatic. It had terms. I went to the drawer where I kept the folder. I hadn't planned to show it that night. I didn't even know, consciously, that I was ready. But my hand didn't hesitate when I pulled it out. Inside were documents I'd been advised to prepare months earlier. Legal options, boundaries made official, a way to define what we'd been circling around without saying. Not abandonment, not exile, just clarity. Consequence put into language the system understood. I set the papers on the table between us. "If I'm not your responsibility," I said, "then neither is this house, or my name, or my silence." That's when he went quiet. For the first time in years, he didn't look defiant. He looked young, confused, like someone realizing that pushing hard enough can actually move something, and sometimes that something doesn't come back. He stared at the papers, then at me, then back down again. And in that moment, I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to admit before. Love, without limits, can become a lie, and lies, even gentle ones, eventually demand to be answered. After that night, nothing exploded. That was the problem. Everything stayed standing, just slightly misaligned, like a house after a small earthquake. Doors still closed, lights still turned on, but every step felt calculated, as if the floor might give way if either of us moved too fast. He didn't sign the papers. He didn't refuse either. He left them where they were, face down on the table, and went to his room. The next morning, they were still there. I moved them back into the folder without a word. We both understood that something had been introduced into the room that couldn't be unseen. The days that followed were quieter than before, not peaceful, strategic. He came and went without explanation. I stopped asking. He stopped pretending to care whether I noticed. Meals went untouched, then disappeared later when I wasn't around. Sometimes I'd hear him on the phone, his voice shifting into something looser, more confident, like he was auditioning for a life that didn't include me. I told myself I was giving him space. What I was really doing was waiting for him to either step back toward me or push far enough that I wouldn't have to be the one to decide. People at work noticed the change before I admitted it to myself. I was distracted, shorter, less patient with things that used to slide off me. At night, I sat at the kitchen table long after the house went dark, replaying conversations that never quite happened. I wondered how many years I'd mistaken endurance for progress. He started missing classes, not dramatically, just enough to test whether anyone was still counting. I got the emails. I didn't forward them. I didn't confront him. I wanted him to bring it up himself. He never did. Once, I found the folder open in his room. The papers were spread across the bed, creased now, familiar. He must have read them. When he noticed me standing there, he didn't look embarrassed. He looked irritated, like I'd walked in on something private. "So that's it?" he said. "That's how this ends?" I told him it wasn't an ending. It was a boundary. He laughed at that, a sharp, humorless sound. He said boundaries were just polite ways to quit on people. That's when I almost gave in, almost apologized, almost told him I didn't mean it, that the papers were just leverage, fear talking. I could feel the old reflex rising. Smooth things over, absorb the damage, keep the peace at any cost. Instead, I said nothing. Silence, it turns out, is its own kind of escalation. A week later, he didn't come home at all. No message, no explanation. I sat in the living room until the sun came up, not panicked, not frantic, just hollow. When he finally walked in the next afternoon, he looked surprised to see me there, like he'd forgotten the house was still occupied. He told me he was 18, told me he could do what he wanted, told me he didn't need permission anymore. I agreed with him, calmly, completely. That unsettled him more than any argument ever had. From that point on, every interaction felt like a negotiation neither of us wanted to formally start. He pushed later. I pulled back sooner. He tested consequences. I stopped cushioning them. I no longer covered for him. I no longer fixed what he broke behind the scenes. When a bill arrived in his name, I set it on the counter and walked away. He accused me of changing. I didn't deny it. The truth was, I was exhausted. Not from conflict, but from the years of believing that if I just held on tighter, things would eventually soften. I was beginning to understand that holding on can also be a way of refusing to see what's actually happening. The papers stayed in the drawer, but they were no longer hypothetical. They had weight now, shape, a timeline I could feel approaching even if I didn't know the exact date. And every day, as we passed each other in hallways that felt narrower than they used to, I could sense it building. Not toward reconciliation, but toward a moment where one of us would finally stop pretending this could remain unfinished. The decision didn't arrive as a speech. It arrived as a sound, a knock, not on the door, on the table. He hit it once with his palm when I told him I wouldn't cover the fee. Not the rent, not food, just the fee for the mess he'd made that week. The noise echoed longer than it should have. He stood there breathing hard, waiting for me to flinch, waiting for the old version of me to step in and smooth it over. Instead, I reached for the drawer. That movement changed the air. He saw it before I pulled it open. He knew what was in there. The folder came out slower than I expected. He laughed under his breath, like I was bluffing too late. "You're really doing this," he said. Not angry now, disbelieving. I set the papers down. This time, I didn't slide them. I placed them. One corner aligned with the table, deliberate. I handed him the pen. "This isn't punishment," I said. My voice surprised me. It didn't shake. "It's recognition." He picked up the pen, then put it down, picked it up again. His leg bounced. I could see the moment he realized this wasn't about control anymore. There was no argument left that would change the outcome, only delay. "You said I'm not your responsibility," I reminded him. "I'm agreeing with you." He stared at the line where his name would go. For a second, his face softened, not into regret, but fear. Real fear. The kind that comes when independence stops being a slogan and starts becoming expensive. "If I sign this," he said, "that's it." I nodded. No speeches, no conditions, no dramatic language. Just the truth. He signed. The pen made a small scratching sound, uneven at first, then firm. When he finished, he didn't look up. He put the pen down carefully, like it might break if he didn't. He stood there, waiting for something. Relief, maybe. Or forgiveness. Neither came. I gathered the papers and slid them back into the folder. My hands were steady, even though my chest felt like it had been scooped out. He grabbed his jacket from the chair, paused at the door. For a moment, I thought he might say something that would crack everything open again. He didn't. He just said, "You didn't have to make it official." I looked at him then. Really looked. "Yes," I said. I did. The door closed behind him with a final ordinary sound, and in that quiet, I understood the weight of what I'd done. Not as a father giving up, but as a man finally accepting that responsibility, like love, can't survive without consent. The house didn't change right away. That surprised me. His room stayed exactly as he'd left it. The bed unmade, a glass on the desk with a ring at the bottom, a jacket still hanging on the back of the chair like he might reach for it later. I didn't rush to erase him. I let the dust decide the timing. Mornings became quieter, but not lighter. I kept setting the kettle out of habit, then catching myself. I stopped halfway through meals, realizing I was cooking for someone who no longer lived there. These weren't dramatic moments, just small interruptions in routine that reminded me something had ended without ceremony. People asked how my son was doing. I didn't correct them. I said he was finding his own way. That was true, as far as I knew. We didn't speak. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into a kind of time that doesn't announce itself anymore. One afternoon, I found the receipt for the adoption fee while cleaning out an old file. I stood there longer than necessary, holding a piece of paper that had once meant beginning. I didn't feel anger. I felt distance, the kind you get from something that used to define you and now just exists as fact. I thought often about the sentence that started everything, not the legal one, the spoken one. "You're not my responsibility." I wondered if he remembered saying it. I wondered if he'd understand someday that I took him at his word, because it was the only way to stop both of us from pretending. There was no apology from either side, no reconciliation scene, just space. Months later, his room was empty, not cleared in one sweep, but gradually, as I needed it. A shirt donated, a book shelved elsewhere. The jacket finally moved. Each decision felt neutral, necessary. I don't tell this story to justify myself. I tell it because responsibility is often misunderstood as endurance, as staying no matter the cost. But sometimes, responsibility is knowing when staying teaches the wrong lesson. I still think of him when I pass certain places, when I hear a laugh that sounds almost like his. The door I closed that day didn't lock my heart. It just closed a chapter that had already been ending for years. What remains is quieter than love, and heavier. It's the memory of choosing truth over comfort, and living with the silence that followed.